Committee will come to order. Committee will come to order. Good morning. On September the 16th, 2008, the Wall Street giant AIG faced immediate bankruptcy. AIG was saved from collapse when the American people came to the rescue with an $85 billion bailout. Less than 2 months later, the American taxpayer was again forced to pay the bill when the Federal Reserve directed AIG to hand out billions of dollars to counterparties that included the biggest names on Wall Street. In effect, the taxpayers were propping up the hollow shells of AIG by stuffing it with money, and the rest of Wall Street came by and looted the corpse. The circumstances surrounding the payments to the counterparties has created an air of suspicion and distrust among the American people, starting with the New York Fed's initial refusal to name the counterparties. The New York Fed argued that disclosing these counterparties would somehow injure AIG. In fact, when the information was finally released under pressure from Congress, nothing happened. It had absolutely no effect on AIG's business or financial condition, but it did have an effect on the credibility of the Federal Reserve, and it called into question the Fed's penchant for secrecy. We need to change the culture on Wall Street and the culture among the regulators from the secrecy of transparency, recognizing that only true, confidential, competitive, or consumer information should be protected. As we sit here, a year and a half later, after AIG handed out billions in taxpayers' dollars because of this secrecy, we still don't know why or how the decision to rescue AIG was made, or who made the decision to offer AIG's trading partners 100 cents on the dollar in the so-called counterparty payments. Every day in the business world, when a company is having financial problems, its creditors have to take less money than they are owed. Otherwise, they risk not getting any money at all. They call this a haircut. In the case of AIG, nobody got a haircut. Instead, they were given a piggy bank full of taxpayers' dollars and said, help yourself. Let me just say plainly that I think just about every American would say the government should have forced AIG's counterparties to take less money. Evidently, major decisions were made by a combination of the Federal Reserve, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and the Bush Treasury Department. Today, we will hear from witnesses who were involved in making these decisions, and we hope they can shed light on a murky set of facts. Under subpoena, the committee obtained more than 250,000 pages of documents from the New York Fed detailing its handling of the AIG counterparties. Particularly disturbing is the fact that these emails indicate that AIG proposed to disclose to the SEC and the public the names of the counterparties and the payments, but it was the New York Feds that directed AIG to withhold this information. As one New York Fed staffer put it, any public disclosure by AIG is still subject to Fed approval. At least two things are clear here. The entire financial regulatory system was broken, and there shouldn't be any more bailouts. The lack of transparency we have seen in the double bailout of AIG leads to distrust, which leads to anger. The question that looms over all of this: how do we prevent a repeat of the financial crisis in the future? Unless the Congress adopt genuine financial services reform, it will be only a matter of time before we see another AIG, another Bear Stearns, another Lehman Brothers, and the next big bank will be too big to fail, and the taxpayers will wind up footing the bill again and again and again. I ask my Republican colleagues on this committee to join with me in fixing the system. Blame is about yesterday. Fixing the system is about today and the future. In the AIG case, we can talk all we want to about complicated business deals, but this all boils down to a simple concept. When average people were losing their homes and jobs, the same big banks that caused the problems got every dollar back courtesy of the American taxpayer. And the Federal Reserve tried to keep important information a secret. Secrecy leads to distrust, and the American people now distrust what happened in these bailouts. Congress has the right to know how and why that happened, and the American people have the right to know how and why that happened. I hope that today we can get answers to these and other important questions. I now yield to our ranking member, the gentleman from California, Congressman Darrell Issa, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and you have our promise that this has been and will continue to be a bipartisan oversight of these and all the issues related to the Fed's current and future authority. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask unanimous consent pursuant to our rules that Spencer Baucus, the ranking member on Financial Services Committee, Kevin Brady of Texas, the ranking House Republican on the Joint Economic Committee, Roy Blunt, the former Majority Whip, Ron Paul, whose credentials on this are well understood, and Cliff Stearns of Florida be allowed to sit on the dais, and should there be time, allowed to ask questions pursuant to the rules.
Without objection.
Additionally, I would ask at this time to submit for the record Schedule A, which is, in fact, the shortfall agreements between Maiden III and AIG Financial Products, since they will be referred to in questioning, and we want to make sure they're officially in the record.
Reserving the right to object.
Okay. Additionally, Mr. Chairman, I would ask unanimous consent that the 8 letters previously sent to Secretary Geithner and as of today not responded to also be placed in the record at this time, although they will not be reviewed further during this hearing.
Reserving the right to object.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for all of this and more. Working together with you on the subpoena documents has caused both the majority and minority to glean considerable new information. In recent weeks, this committee receiving these documents have caused us to better understand the New York Fed pressured AIG to abort negotiations designed to obtain a haircut, as it was called, from its counterparties and keep the details of the counterparties' payments from appearing on forms the firm's forms at the SEC. Today, one of the questions we will ask is, should the American people be kept from knowing until 2018 the details of who were the ultimate beneficiaries of this bailout? As I have said before, I consider this a backdoor bailout. The people giving us testimony today will tell us that they felt that this was essential and necessary. Mr. Chairman, as you can recall, AIG's founder, Hank Greenberg, has previously testified along with AIG CEO Edward Liddy. And in that testimony, Hank Greenberg made it very clear that he believed that, 1, hedging should have occurred sooner, and 2, bankruptcy would have been a cleaner way to resolve a company in which he is the largest stockholder. I'm proud to say after that hearing, AIG has re-engaged their founder to help them maximize the value of a company that is currently 80% owned by the American people. Not to say that there's a lot of good news at AIG. Mr. Chairman, it's clear that the money paid and it being kept secret may ultimately cause the American people never to be repaid these dollars. I'll try to, can you hear me okay now? You can't. Okay. Now, okay, I will focus on this microphone this time. Usually the problem is I'm too well heard. Right, Mr. Chairman?
Generally.
Today we will have an opportunity to ask questions, and the American people will have the right, and I believe will receive, straightforward answers. So far, Mr. Chairman, this is what we know. We know that some of today's witnesses played a central role in the decision to bail out AIG rather than allow the normal bankruptcy procedures to run their course. We know that one of today's witnesses made the decision to pay AIG counterparties at 100 cents on the dollar. We know that one of today's witnesses was the primary architect of the AIG trust agreement, whereby the taxpayers' investment in AIG is managed not in the interest of the U.S. taxpayers, but of the United States Treasury Department. That was from previous testimony, and we rely on that to say perhaps that is not the right answer. We know that the New York Fed sought to cover the counterparty payments made possible by the taxpayers' money. We now better understand that the New York Fed transferred their earlier responsibility to the American people after TARP was passed. We know that the New York Fed succeeded in getting the SEC to continue the cover-up until 2018, 10 years from the date the bailout began. And we know that the full amount paid to AIG's counterparties will likely never be repaid to the American people. Some facts, Mr. Chairman, remain unknown or uncertain. Secretary Geithner has claimed publicly that he recused himself from the day-to-day management of New York Fed when the cover-up occurred. In fact, he has asserted complete ignorance of the Fed's efforts to cover up the bailout details. Many people, including members of this committee, have a hard time believing that Secretary Geithner entered into an absolute cone of silence, for those of us old enough to remember what that was, on the day of his nomination was announced. Where was Secretary Geithner for the months and months that backdoor bailouts were being questioned in the media? Did he ever wonder why his decision to pay AIG's counterparty was kept secret for so long? These are the questions the American people deserve. Mr. Chairman, I would ask unanimous consent the remainder of my opening statement be placed in the record at this time.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, gentleman from California. At this time, we would like to turn to our first witness, the Treasury Secretary Geithner. It is committee policy that all witnesses are sworn in. So, Mr. Secretary, if you would stand and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? If so, let the record reflect that the answer is affirmative. You may be seated.
Chairman Towns, Ranking Member Issa, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. I welcome the committee's attention to this issue, and we will continue to work closely with this committee, with all other oversight bodies.
Mr. Secretary, pull the mic just a little closer. We're having a little trouble
So
hearing.
I'm almost eating it.
I know.
How's that
Shows
sound
you
now?
our sound system is not too good around here. We keep budget
I don't think I
cutting.
can make it any closer. I want to make sure that the American people have a comprehensive view of the actions we took to end this financial crisis. Deciding to support AIG was one of the most difficult choices I've ever been involved in over 20 years of public service. The steps that were taken were motivated solely by what we believe to be in the public interest. We did not act because AIG asked for help. We did not act to protect individual institutions. We acted because the consequences of AIG failing would have been catastrophic for our economy and for American families and businesses. More than a year removed from that terrible week of September 2008, I believe that the government strategy, and it was the government strategy, was the best of the available options and will ultimately cost the taxpayer far less than many feared and far less than many alternatives many people suggest today would have been better. And importantly, if you join with the President in adopting his proposed financial responsibility fee, American taxpayers will not have to pay 1 cent for the actions we took in AIG or the actions we took with the authority Congress gave the administration to stabilize this financial crisis. AIG's problems became acute just a few days before Lehman declared bankruptcy. At that time, our financial system and our economy stood at the brink of collapse. The banks and financial institutions that Americans rely on to protect their savings, to help finance their children's education, to help pay their bills, were at risks in which few Americans had ever experienced. The banks and the financial markets that businesses rely on to meet payroll, to build inventory, to fund new investments, to create new jobs, were threatened like at no time since the Great Depression. Across the country, across the United States of America, people were rapidly losing confidence in our financial system and in the government's ability to safeguard their economic security. In the midst of this storm, AIG posed a much greater threat than Lehman. AIG was much larger. It was spread across the globe, and its failure would have been far worse, hitting Americans in ways Lehman could not. AIG was one of the largest life and health insurance companies in the country, one of the largest property and casualty insurers, providing insurance to 180,000 small businesses and other corporate entities, which together employed about 100 million people. AIG had sold products to protect local and city governments, pension funds, and thousands of public and private companies through guaranteed investment contracts and protection for 401ks. And as problematic, AIG had engaged in a broad range of financial activities that strayed well beyond traditional insurance businesses. Using a credit rating based on the strength and profitability of its insurance companies, it had become one of the largest providers of complicated financial products in the world. It made hundreds of billions of dollars of financial commitments without the resources to back up those commitments. AIG should have never been allowed to take those risks. But it was. Its insurance regulators in 20 different states, the regulators in other countries responsible for overseeing their international activities, and its holding company supervisors, the Office of Thrift Supervision, did not act to constrain the risks AIG was taking. Important to recall that the Federal Reserve was given no responsibility and no authority to contain risks that AIG was taking. No one acted to constrain risk-taking by AIG. And none of those regulators, in the moment of crisis, had any ability to respond to its failure. The government of the United States did not have the ability to seize AIG and wind it down in an orderly way as the FDIC can and does for banks. Neither the bankruptcy code nor insolvency procedures for insurance companies could have handled the job. And there was no way to draw a line around AIG and prevent its failure from wreaking havoc across the system. The Federal Reserve was at the center of response to the crisis because it was the only fire station operating. The Federal Reserve faced a terrible choice: to support AIG, putting billions of dollars of taxpayer resources at risk, or to let AIG fail and accept potentially catastrophic damage to the economy. We were not willing to accept such a catastrophe. So just 4 days after the AIG was drawn into that crisis, the AIG crisis, we extended AIG a line of credit secured by its insurance businesses. In return, the taxpayer took about an 80% stake in the company and began the process of restructuring management and the board and the firm itself. That initial action helped stem the bleeding for a time, but given the massive losses AIG faced and given the force of the storm moving across the global financial system, it was not enough. And we had to work very quickly, almost from the beginning, to design and implement a broader, more permanent restructuring. AIG needed capital, not just a line of credit. And AIG's vulnerability to future losses, to the bleeding of cash, had to be reduced. On November 10th, the Federal Reserve and the Department of the Treasury jointly announced a series of steps designed to stabilize the company. The Treasury invested $440 billion of preferred capital under the authority Congress provided the executive branch under the TARP. and the Federal Reserve helped establish and fund two entities called Maiden Lane 2 and 3 to purchase a range of assets from the company that were threatening AIG's financial solvency. Maiden Lane 3 in particular has been the subject appropriately of a range of questions about how we treated firms that had bought these insurance contracts from AIG. And in this effort, and I want to make this very clear, in this effort, our objective was, as always, to get the best deal for the American taxpayer. And we faced a number of options. If we had let AIG default on the contracts, AIG would have gone into bankruptcy, triggering all the disastrous economic consequences we had feared since September that led the government to act initially. If we had continued to lend AIG money to meet these obligations, its growing debt would have led to a credit ratings downgrade, bringing down the firm itself and putting more taxpayer dollars at risk. If we had tried to force counterparties to accept less than they were legally entitled to, market participants would have lost confidence in AIG, leading to the company's collapse. The counterparties could have refused. They could have kept the billions in collateral they had already taken. They could have kept the billions in securities they already had. And they could have sued AIG for breach of contract. We did not have the luxury of time. We could not engage in protracted negotiations. AIG's financial position was deteriorating rapidly day by day. The prospect of failure was imminent. So we restructured those contracts to stop the bleeding and potentially recover some value for the taxpayer in the future. Now, although the government still faces the risk of substantial losses in its overall exposure to AIG, we expect that this particular transaction, the very one that is the heart of so much controversy, will be paid off in full with interest, generating some profit for the American taxpayer. Now, on November 24th, after President Obama announced his intention to nominate me for Secretary of the Treasury, and after broad consultation with the Chairman of the Federal Reserve and others, I decided to stay on as President of New York Fed on an interim basis, but I withdrew from monetary policy decisions, policies involving individual financial institutions, and day-to-day management of the New York Fed. I had no role before or after November 24th in making decisions regarding what to disclose about the specific financial terms of Maiden Lane 2 and 3 and payments to AIG counterparties. Mr. Chairman, the broad strategy that the government adopted to contain this financial crisis has been remarkably effective at stemming the crisis, breaking the momentum of the crisis, and repairing the damage. And this has been achieved at much lower cost in taxpayer resources than many people anticipated. Confidence in the basic stability of the American financial system is much stronger today. Borrowing costs for American businesses and consumers, for households, for municipal and state governments have fallen dramatically. The economy is now growing. The support we provided to AIG in the context of the broad strategy to put out this financial fire was essential to achieving this early beginning of healing and recovery. Banks have already repaid 2/3 of the TARP investments that my predecessor appropriately made. The only support this administration has provided to banks since I took office, to banks, was $7 billion to regional small community banks. More than 75% of the emergency government guarantees that I inherited when I took into office have now been shut down and closed at a profit to taxpayers. Over the last year, the expected cost of stabilizing the financial system has fallen by over $400 billion. That is real resources that we can use to meet the many other challenges we face as a country. And if Congress joins with us in adopting the President's proposal for a financial responsibility fee, the American taxpayer will recoup every penny of potential losses under the TARP. Now, this economy is still in crisis, but because of the government's actions, the American financial system is now in a position where it can provide the credit necessary for economic growth. And that is essential to lay the foundation for job growth and long-term economic prosperity. Now, let me close by saying this. If you are outraged by AIG, and you should be, if you are outraged by what happened with AIG, then you should be deeply committed to financial reform. The United States of America should never have let institutions like AIG take on a level of risk that could threaten the stability of the financial system. And the government of the United States should never have been in the position going into a crisis of this severity without the basic tools able to contain the damage and protect the taxpayer. So I hope you will join us in working to put in place a strong package of financial reforms that will protect consumers, protect investors, protect the taxpayer, and protect our economy from excessive risk-taking by financial institutions. And Mr. Chairman, one final thought. The public servants involved in making these decisions acted solely in the public interest, acted solely in the interest of the American taxpayer. They are dedicated Americans who bring to government service enormous experience and the highest integrity. I would never, and they would never, be part of any decision, any public decision intended for private benefit and not the public interest. The decisions we made together regarding AIG were enormously consequential. They were terribly difficult. They were the subject of extraordinary controversy within each of the institutions responsible. And for that reason, they were subject to enormous care and deliberation. But I believe a fair reading of history, a careful, fair reading of history, of all the judgments we made, will demonstrate that the actions we took, and I was there, were essential to preventing broader catastrophe, and the solutions we took reduced the ultimate cost of the American taxpayer, and the American economy is much stronger today as a result. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. Let me begin by asking a couple of questions. Were you involved in any discussions with AIG or your staff involved where you discussed what AIG should or should not disclose to the public?
Mr. Chairman, as I said, I had no role in making those decisions. But as the record shows, and the record before the committee shows, a large number of people at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and the Federal Reserve Board in Washington played a very active role in thinking through those difficult choices.
But I'm not sure I got the answer there.
Well, may I say again, I personally played no role before the 24th or after in making those decisions. But you asked whether any employees of the New York Fed did. Of course they did.
Okay. When you were the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, when did you recuse yourself from matters involving specific companies, and why did you recuse yourself?
On November 24th, the President announced his intention to nominate me as Secretary of the Treasury. That forced me to make a set of decisions about what was appropriate for me to do, given the unique circumstances of that time. And after consulting with the Chairman of the Federal Reserve, with the Chairman of my board, with my General Counsel, and with a range of other officials, collectively we decided that it was in the best interest of the Fed and the incoming administration for me to remove myself from day-to-day involvement in the Fed's policy issues, to leave that responsibility to my colleagues at the New York Fed, led by the executive, the first vice president of the New York Fed, but not to step down as president. And we made that decision because we wanted to make sure we were protecting the independence of the Fed, and because I was going to be spending by necessity a huge part of my time in helping shape the President's economic agenda, and I was not going to be able to give the care and effort needed to carry on running the Fed on a day-to-day basis. Our judgment was that was the best decision at the time. I'm confident of that in retrospect. It was unique. It was unique, but I don't think it was a better alternative available.
Mm-hmm. Secretary Geithner, I don't think AIG's counterparties should have been paid 100 cents on the dollar. Because in this email we have here, it's on the screen as well, you had some interest in how much the counterparties were owed. Please tell the committee what impact the counterparties' exposure had on your decision to pay 100 cents on the dollar.
Mr. Chairman, that played no role in our decision. As I said in my opening statement, as I testified before, we had to make a difficult choice about what was going to prevent the failure of the firm at least cost to the taxpayer. If we had broken those contracts, if AIG had not paid them in full, if we had threatened default, if we had imposed haircuts, if we had selectively imposed haircuts, that would have brought about a downgraded its rating, the firm would not have been able to operate, and it would have collapsed. It was because of those choices we took the path we did, to restructure the contracts and leave the taxpayer with some of the potential upside in those securities. Now, judging what is systemic and why a failure of AIG might matter for the system as a whole is a very difficult judgment to make. There's no black and white choice in that context. But our judgment was, as I said in my testimony, that AIG's collapse would have dramatically magnified all the effects you saw in the immediate aftermath of Lehman's failure, and in some ways they would have been more consequential because they would have spread to a set of insurance businesses, and that would have been much worse for the country. So we were guided by a simple but terrible choice: how best to prevent default at least cost to the taxpayer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. I now yield to the gentleman from California, Ranking Member Congressman Issa.
Thank you,
5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm going to pick up pretty much where you left off. Secretary Geithner, I think, pardon me? I think you've answered, that you played no role in the decision to not disclose the full payment, the 100% payment to the counterparties, that you were not part of what some of us have called a cover-up. Is that right?
Absolutely.
Okay. Let me follow up then. If after November 24th you were not involved in any activity, then one more, just to be clear, did you ever become involved with the Federal Reserve's disclosure decision with respect to AIG counterparty claims after your nomination as Treasury Secretary? In other words, have you ever participated or questioned or stayed involved with that?
No, I did not.
Well, from what we were given by the Fed, could we put up slide 1? This email from you says to William Dudley, your replacement, on March of 2009, and it, where's the line to read here? Okay, yeah, it's easier to read on the screen. Where are you on the AIG counterparty disclosure issue? Long after you left, you made this email. What was it about, and what was the answer?
Well, Congressman, as you know, this question of disclosure was the subject of huge amount of controversy. And most people...
You think?
Yeah. That's what my son says, and I agree with you. And I think most people feel as you do. They said, why shouldn't it be disclosed? Why shouldn't it be disclosed? And as you know, in March, which I think, if I'm not mistaken,
yeah,
that
it was
was
March
the
15th.
time of this email, it had been subject of testimony by the Vice Chairman of the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve was facing a huge amount of pressure and attention over whether to disclose. So I assume I was doing what you might expect in that context and asking them, where were they? Were they going to change their position?
Okay. Well, then following up on your continued involvement and looking at them, where are you on this? Do you believe that there should be full disclosure, as the President has said, that these kinds of instruments should be public, that essentially they be like any other instrument, the details of which should be available broadly?
Congressman, I believe deeply that trust and confidence in the financial system requires disclosure and transparency. I believe that trust and confidence in the government requires that our actions be subject to full exposure and review by careful, independent analysis. And I have been very, very supportive since I came into office and before to making sure we were bringing an unprecedented level of disclosure to the transparency around the actions of the government. I'll just give you a few examples. When I came into office, we put the financial terms of all of the transactions we undertook under the TARP in the public domain for everyone to see. One of the reasons our financial strategy has been successful in bringing a measure of stability back to our system is we compelled the largest institutions in the country to subject their balance sheets to a level of disclosure.
Secretary, and I appreciate what you've been doing as Treasury Secretary, but I have in front of me from the Fed marked confidential the details of who benefited, who got these benefits, and currently it's locked up till 2018 by an order that wasn't negotiated and final until May of this year, or May of last year, long after you were obviously able to be involved, that locks up the public knowing. And these are assets the American people have paid for in full, right? Do you believe that we should know about these?
Congressman, that's an issue that I think you need to direct to the New York Fed and to the SEC.
Okay, well,
You asked me a question that I didn't quite get a chance to answer before, which is, you said, what was my view, in effect,
yes,
of what the Fed ultimately did? It's very important to recognize that the Fed did, in March of 2009, fully release information on the counterparties and the details of that transaction. And based on what I know, I thought the decision was appropriate then. Now, I know a lot of people have said,
okay,
should that have come sooner? I think reasonable people could come to that judgment, but I did not stand in their shoes at the time.
Now, as a member and the head of the New York Fed, and also, I guess, broadly a member of the board generally, until you were sworn in.
Gentleman's time's expired.
I'll just finish up this one question, Mr. Chairman, very quickly. You were aware that Chairman Bernanke, in fact, had in front of him from the staff a report that said AIG should be allowed to go bankrupt, which was then held back on September 16th, based on his decision on September 15th, not to disclose this for a broad vote of the board, weren't you?
I'm not aware of the email you referred to, but I'm aware of the following, and I want to emphasize
The witness
this.
may answer the question, and then we're going to move on to the next questioner.
Thank you. Every decision we made in the days before September 16th and afterwards were enormously controversial decisions.
No, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman's time's
I
expired.
understand.
Chair recognizes Mr. Kanjorski.
I would ask unanimous consent to just get an answer to the question. It'll be very quick.
Each member has 5 minutes. Without objection, the witness can answer the question. We're going to move on to
The
Mr.
only question we
Kanjorski.
want is, were you aware of that? And if you weren't, do you think you should have been aware of that for a vote on September 16th? That's all.
Well, I was aware that there was enormous concern both in the New York Fed and at the Federal Reserve Board about the choices we were confronted. As I said, there is nothing more controversial and difficult than I think anything we face in this context. And I think it should be reassuring and no surprise that those actions, and the record will show that those actions were the subject of enormous debate. And they were the subject of debate before the 16th and afterwards. And every time we faced the possibility of having to do more, we all stepped back and said, do we really need to do that? Does that make sense? And that is a good thing for the country. You had people willing to debate that and argue it forcefully.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Mr. Kanjorski.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, there's a famous expression, I think it comes from one of the fine poets of our era. We have come to bury Caesar, not to praise him. And I hope you appreciate the role of Caesar that you're playing today. But it made me think about the fact that last Sunday I watched a ball game, and in the closing moments of the ball game, the quarterback made a tremendous decision to pass the football and got intercepted. And as a result, the opposing team took the ball down the field and kicked a field goal and won the game. And I convened several meetings in New York after that game and met extensively on Monday and Tuesday, and we have concluded that he just did the absolute worst thing that he could have done. Every one of us at those meetings would have made the correct decision after the fact. I think the point I'm trying to make is I do share some of the sympathies with you, because I was on the committee and the task force that was working with the Secretary and with the Chairman of the Federal Reserve when the crisis occurred. And I caution some of the members, I think even of this committee, were AWOL for the votes that we needed to authorize the saving of the American economy. As I've heard your testimony, you've come to the conclusion that if the rescue package had not been passed by the Congress of the United States authorizing the Secretary and the President to take extraordinary action and commit hundreds of billions of dollars of taxpayers' money, we wouldn't be sitting in this room today. We probably wouldn't be operating under the Constitution that was saved as a result of that precipitous action taken in a very short period of time. Is that relatively correct?
I completely agree. And those members of Congress on both sides of the aisle that voted to authorize that action did the right and the necessary and the courageous thing. And they made it possible for my predecessor and the Federal Reserve to start to stabilize this thing. And it would not have been possible without that authority and without that legislation.
I appreciate that. I sometimes, as a matter of fact, I took that argument to the White House at that time. If you remember, the President was not as outspoken. And I always was convinced that in a democracy such as ours, transparency, both in bad news and dangerous news, must be shared with the people. And part of the problem at that time, we didn't share that news. And even to today, most people in this audience and most people throughout America have no idea how close we came to total annihilation and disaster. Is that correct?
That is my view. I think for the first time since the Great Depression, you were seeing a full-scale run on the financial system. People were taking their savings out of banks. They wondered whether a dollar was a dollar, whether a dollar in a money market fund would be worth a dollar. They worried about whether a dollar lent to a AAA company would be worth a dollar. It was a basic calamitous breakdown in the fabric of our system. And no recovery would have been possible without starting to stabilize the system and stem the bleeding. And that was something that could not happen without the authority that, as I said, many people in this room, many people on both sides of the aisle voted to approve.
Am I correct that there were discussions held at the highest echelons of the United States government and the Congress at that very time as to whether or not law and order could be secured in the United States if we did not take precipitous action to assure the people that the economic markets of the United States and the world would be held secure?
Well, I was not in the executive branch at that time, so I can't speak to that, but it would not surprise me if that was the case. Again, this was the gravest crisis we had seen since the Great Depression. It was not going to solve itself. Many people advocated we should let it burn itself out, but that would have been catastrophic for the economy. We're still living with the consequences of the damage and the wreckage. The scale of the challenges we face today as an economy are rooted in that crisis, and they illustrate the force of the pressure and the momentum that was already, we were already living with in August of that summer.
All decisions made in those fateful 2 weeks weren't the correct decisions, were they?
Oh, Congressman, I think every day about things we could have done differently and done early. And I think a great strength of this country is that people in the Congress, in independent oversight bodies, in the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission, are going to take a cold, hard look at everything that was done. And that'll give us a better basis.
Time's expired. You may continue with your answer and continue.
And that'll give us a better basis for fixing this mess and preventing it from happening again. And we will cooperate fully in all that effort.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Thank the gentleman. Chair recognizes Mr. Burton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Your counsel, one of your counsels, James Bergen, said on March the 12th, I don't know if there's any way to manage it so the Congress won't ask for it, or if they do, won't release it. Does he work for you? Or did he work for you?
Yes, he did.
Does your legal counsel have the authority to make comments and decisions without your knowledge?
Of course. But
regarding something of this import?
well, as president and CEO of the New York Fed, of course, I was ultimately
this doesn't require
responsible.
a long dissertation.
No, it's not a long answer.
All I want to know is, do they have the authority to make these kinds of comments and decisions without you knowing about it?
Of course.
On, what's the date on this? On November the 11th, when you were still at the Fed, an internal memo said, as a matter of course, we do not want to disclose that the concession is at par unless absolutely necessary. Are you familiar with that memo?
Not with that email. As I said, I was not involved in decisions about what to disclose about the individual transactions or the names of counterparties. But I have enormous trust and confidence in the integrity of judgment of people who were.
And then on March the 15th, after that, we had up on the board there a few minutes ago the email to Mr. Dudley. It says, where are you on the counterparty disclosure issue? And Dudley responded, my understanding is that it is in train and could come out as early as today. Are you familiar with that?
I don't recall his response, and I didn't recall my email until you put it in front of him, but now I see it.
You don't remember that?
No, I don't, but I do remember at the time there was still enormous building pressure on the Fed to disclose, and they did disclose.
But you still maintain that you weren't involved in any of this?
Yes, absolutely.
Were you aware that all of these organizations around the world, Societe Generale, Goldman Sachs, Merrill Lynch, Deutsche Bank, UBS, were all getting 100 cents on the dollar?
Absolutely.
You were aware of all that? Why wasn't this disclosed back in November when you were the head of the Fed?
Well, again, that is a question you need to direct to the people who were responsible for that judgment.
Well, you were the head of the Fed.
I was the head of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York until I was confirmed by the Senate for this job.
Why wouldn't this have been disclosed by you back then?
Well,
I mean, you're
Congressman,
saying that, what was this, a group that
I
made
don't
the
know
decision?
how to say it any differently, but when the President announced his intention to nominate me, I withdrew appropriately from a whole range of policy decisions of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, in part to protect the Fed, in part so I could do my job of helping the President prepare for how to fix the mess we inherited. Now, because of that, I was not involved in those decisions, but I want to say the people who made those decisions did so.
This happened on November the 11th before you withdrew.
What happened on November?
This knowledge.
Oh, Mr. Chairman, as I said in my testimony, I was.
Why wasn't it disclosed back then?
Well, we didn't face that choice then. I was directly involved in the judgments that we collectively made.
You didn't face the choice back then?
No, we didn't. No, but the choice that I was deeply involved in, fully support, believe was the right choice, was the decision to restructure these contracts in a way that was better for the taxpayer and prevented the fall of the company. I was fully supportive of that, fully aware of that.
It stretches credulity for us to believe that you had no role in this and didn't know anything about it when your attorneys and people that work for you were sending emails all around the place, and you were the head of the Fed and you didn't know anything about it. It just doesn't make any sense to me, and I think a lot of my colleagues feel the same way.
Congressman, I was president of the New York Fed throughout that time. We were involved, as you know, in an extraordinary, complicated range of things.
But this is major stuff.
The decisions around AIG were major and hugely consequential, and they were done with enormous care and judgment. But the choices around disclosure, which understandably are the focus of so much attention, are not judgments I could speak to.
Let me just finish by asking this. Do you think that there ought to be an annual audit of the Fed?
I am very supportive.
Gentleman's time expired, but Mr. Secretary, you may answer the question.
I am very supportive, as part of financial reform, of trying to make sure that the Fed is subject to an adequate level of transparency and disclosure and oversight. And the chairman of the Federal Reserve has worked with many members in Congress in helping shape reforms that would achieve that outcome. In doing that, though, I want to be, it's very important we protect the independence of the Fed on monetary policy issues. It would be a deep mistake for the country, a grave mistake for the country, to threaten that independence.
Chair recognizes Mr. Cummings. You may proceed.
Secretary Geithner, I don't know whether you realize this, but it was the Democrats that asked for this hearing. I specifically asked for this hearing. Did you know that?
I believe I did know that.
And let me tell you that when I asked for the hearing, I must tell you that I was extremely concerned, and I was questioning whether you had acted appropriately. And I think anyone who read headlines back then when this hearing was requested would have come to at least the question mark. And you stood here a few moments ago and you swore that you would tell the truth. Is that correct?
I did.
And is that correct? And I assume that the statement, your written statement, is a statement which you would also swear to?
Absolutely.
And I can tell you that as I read your written statement, I'm trying to figure out, as far as the initial getting involved with AIG and what you all did, I don't know what anybody else would have done. I don't think we had a choice. Or did you have a choice? So let me say that I think we did the right thing there. Now, this is where it gets sticky. We also have a situation, Secretary Geithner, where the American people are concerned that a lot is being done for Wall Street, but not enough being done for Main Street. You understand that?
Absolutely.
And one of the interesting things is that you talked about how if you had not taken the action from the beginning, how it might have affected Main Street, the constituents of all 435 members. Can you tell us, if you hadn't taken the action, how might it would affect students in my district or businesses or whatever? Can you tell us that? Because I don't think that that's getting through.
Thousands of more factories would have closed their doors. Millions more Americans would have lost their jobs. The value of America's houses and savings would have fallen even further than they did at that time. People would have rushed to take their money out of banks. It would have brought about utter collapse. I don't know a better way to say it than that. And if people wonder whether that was true, I think all they have to do is look back at what actually happened in the fall of 2008. And you saw the value of American savings fall by almost 40%. Trillions of dollars in lost wealth. Millions of Americans lost their homes. Thousands and thousands of businesses had to close. That's what happens when you let a financial crisis get out of control. Governments should never let that happen. But if they don't act, and this is a very important thing to people understand, people think it's unfair for the government to act to rescue a financial system. But you cannot help an economy recover. You can't create jobs. You can't preserve the value of people's savings without a functioning financial system.
Another moment when we requested the hearing that I was concerned about was this counterparties. As you probably know, I, along with 26 other members of Congress, requested that Siktar Borowski look into that whole issue. And there have been comments at the Capitol levels that the counterparties were tenuous, and had they not been paid in full, they risk collapse. Was this a real possibility?
In my judgment, that was not the most important risk posed by AIG. AIG's failure would have posed some direct losses on those major banks. But those losses themselves were not the issue. They would not have been significant. The threat to the system, and this was a threat to all institutions operating, was the threat of collapse of the system as a whole. And if AIG had failed, you would have seen a crisis spread to insurance companies around the world, and you would have seen investors, depositors, creditors pull back from every financial institution in the world, and that would have brought a much more precipitous collapse in all financial values.
My time is running out. Just real quick. When the public has so much invested in a company, isn't it better to err on the side of transparency, Mr. Secretary, as opposed to keeping things secret?
Of course, of course.
So so what would push the decision to not be as transparent? I mean, what would cause that?
There are very few cases where it is necessary for there to be either a lag in disclosure or some gap. I'm not sure how to the best way to explain this, but like in national security, like in law enforcement,
Gentleman's
like
time's
in-
expired, but you can conclude
like in the
answer.
protection of confidential supervisory information, but also to protect the taxpayer, there are some areas in which you need to be careful about how you manage that. That's a discussion, though, you should have with my colleagues at the Fed. They're in a better position to answer it. But we would not want to disclose information that would be bad for the taxpayer, make it harder for the taxpayer to recoup our investments. But in general, Congressman, I completely agree that transparency and disclosure are essential. The American people deserve it, and we have been very effective in bringing an unprecedented level of security to all the basic actions we took in this financial crisis, an
Thank-
unprecedented level of transparency and disclosure.
Thank you very much,
gentlemen.
Chairman.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Mr. Micah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, it's kind of interesting the way you framed your testimony and your involvement in some of these decisions before the committee today. I think you've tried to give the impression that you had to do what you had to do because of the financial situation. That's pretty much what you've said, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Thank you. And then you used the term, you kept using the term, we made decisions together. Then you said a dividing line of November 24th. That was that when you received the word that you were going to be nominated for Treasury Secretary?
That's when the announcement was made.
Yes. So you've tried to distance yourself from decisions that were made before that, but in fact,
No, I have not tried to I take
well,
pride
just
and
saying,
full responsibility for all those decisions.
Okay, then you also were aware when the New York Federal Reserve Board ultimately selected on November 3rd, 2008 to purchase the underlying assets.
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
You were.
And again, as I said, I take pride in that decision.
What you said is also you had no knowledge of any cover-up, right? Or intent not to give full information and disclosure.
Of course not.
Of course not. So you took credit for the decision, but not the cover-up.
No.
You've distanced yourself from any cover-up before November 24th, and then, of course, you were out of the picture from November 24th forward. Is that correct?
Congressman, I'm not trying to distance myself from anything. I will take complete responsibility for decisions I played a role in shaping, was part of shaping, including all decisions up to the 24th in this case. And I'm happy to take responsibility for all decisions I've made since then, too.
Then you were aware of 100 cents on a dollar bailout.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. And the risk that was posed by that offer. So you knew about that, but you weren't attempting to cover up. That's your testimony
Of course not.
today. Okay. So I believe either you made a bad decision there, or, in fact, there was the attempt to cover up one of the biggest bailouts, backdoor bailouts, in history. Now, you've tried to frame it as you did it because you did it in the interest of the people and the failure of the system. I'm telling you, I believe these are lame excuses. Either you were in charge and did the wrong thing, or you participated in the wrong thing. To me, it appears like, when you were being confirmed, a lot of controversy surrounded your not paying your taxes. You gave lame excuses then. I believe you're giving the committee lame excuses now. And my final question is, why shouldn't we ask for your resignation as Secretary of the Treasury? I didn't think you should have been Secretary of the Treasury when it was disclosed that you didn't pay your taxes, because that's the highest financial responsibility position in the United States government. So why shouldn't you step down
That is your right. That is your right to that opinion. I have worked in public service all my life. I have never been a politician. I have served my country as carefully and ably as I can, and it is a great privilege for me to work with this president to help repair the damage that was here when we took office. Yes. And I will do so as long as he asks me to do so, to the best of my ability, with great pride in this country and in him.
Yeah. Again, I think you're punting the blame, and I think you're trying to position yourself as the savior
Congressman, you don't know me very well.
Institution, and yet
you don't know me very well.
I believe that we're not getting the whole story. We're getting a lame story in a monumental backdoor decision of bailout, for which the American taxpayers will stay on the hook for huge amounts of money. Even by estimates of the Treasury Department, there will be billions of dollars from this deal, which either you should have been overseeing, and you said you had knowledge of, and you failed to take some steps to further protect the taxpayer interest. You were either incompetent on the job, or you were not doing your job and knew what was taking place and tried to conceal it. And I think that's grounds for your removal.
Congressman, I was there. I know what I was responsible for. I take full responsibility and I take great pride in those judgments.
The gentleman's time has expired, but the Secretary may answer the question as he
He
sees
takes
fit.
great pride in those judgments.
I do. I take great pride in those judgments. And people have a right to disagree with them. And they have a right to go back and look at them with great care and analysis. And I hope you will give the same care and judgment to looking at those decisions in retrospect with the benefit of hindsight that we gave in making those decisions at that time.
Thank the gentleman. It's my time to answer or ask questions, and I'm yielding myself 5 minutes. Mr. Geithner, the New York Fed agreed to Goldman Sachs' demands for billions to settle its counterparty claims with AIG, 100 cents on a dollar. But for more than a year before that, Goldman and AIG had been locked into a dispute over that money, and Goldman believed it would lose up to $2.5 billion if AIG defaulted. Did you know at the time that Goldman Sachs had concluded it would not receive 100 cents on a dollar from AIG in the event of default?
I did not know, and I don't know whether that's true or not.
Goldman had said publicly that they didn't need the government's money, that it was fully hedged, and would not have been materially affected if AIG had defaulted. But that turns out to be disingenuous. Committee investigators have learned that Goldman's supplemental insurance policy would not pay in the event that the U.S. government bailed out AIG. Goldman's protection would pay only in the event AIG defaulted. Goldman had not anticipated the government bailout and so hadn't put that contingency into the terms of its contracts. That failure put Goldman at real risk of losing the entire amount of disputed money once the government rescued AIG. Did you have any knowledge at the time? Did Lloyd Blankfein or anyone at Goldman ever admit to you, or anyone working under you, that Goldman Sachs was not fully hedged in the event the government took over AIG, and that Goldman was at risk of losing at least $2.5 billion if the government bailed out AIG and imposed less than 100 cents on a dollar on counterparties?
Congressman, I am not aware, and I don't see how I could have been aware, of the precise details of the hedging strategies of all those firms to the event of a default by AIG. But we made a very careful effort to try to assess, working with the supervisors of all the institutions that exposure to AIG, about what their economic exposure would be.
Had you talked to Lloyd Blankfein, for example, about this? Do you remember talking to him?
In the Goldman Sachs case in particular, because there were a lot of press reports that were consequential in this case, I did ask them directly what their exposure was, and I asked them to show me what their internal information system reports showed about that exposure.
The committee, if I may, is going to have a series of questions to submit to you in writing, so that you'll be given an opportunity to have an extensive answer on this point. Now, Mr. Secretary, once the government stepped in, there was only one way for Goldman Sachs to get any piece of the $2.5 billion, and that was if the New York Fed voluntarily agreed to give it to them. Now, if the New York Fed had fought for taxpayers, Goldman would have lost money it didn't have any hope of recovering. In spite of public statements to the contrary, the New York Fed had a lot of leverage to negotiate a reduction which would have saved taxpayers billions. But instead, the New York Fed took Goldman Sachs' position in its dispute with AIG and settled it fully with taxpayers' money. Now, Mr. Geithner, under normal circumstances, Goldman Sachs would have had to sue AIG in court to recover the disputed $2.5 billion, and they would have settled for something less than that. Isn't it true that the New York Fed gave Goldman Sachs a better deal than it could have ever expected from AIG or any market player at any other time?
Congressman, if we had the ability, like we have for normal companies, to put them through bankruptcy, if we had the ability, like we have for banks, to put them into an orderly wind down process like quasi-bankruptcy, we could have done many things. But under the laws of the land, we did not have the ability. So we faced a very simple choice. Let AIG default or prevent it. And there was no way financial, legal, or otherwise, we could have imposed haircuts, selectively default on any of those institutions without the risk of downgrade and default. And that is the only reason.
I just want to say, Mr. Secretary, since when does saving the system require the taxpayers to give a better deal than the market would normally deliver? Yet, that is what the New York Fed did. The government gave Goldman Sachs more than Goldman Sachs had any right to expect, while at the same time giving no financial relief whatever to millions of Americans facing a foreclosure crisis. And if that doesn't illustrate what the New York Fed thought it was working for, or who it was working for, I don't know what does.
Congressman,
you may respond, and then my time's expired.
Congressman, that is not true, and it is unfair to the public servants.
What's not true?
What you just said.
What's not? What? What isn't true?
It is not true that the actions we took in AIG were for the benefit of anybody but the millions of Americans who, at that point, were suffering from the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. The only way to help reduce that damage, protect that damage, was to fix the system and prevent catastrophic failure that would have made that crisis worse. That is the only motive that underpinned these actions by the government.
I thank the gentleman. My time's expired. The chair recognizes Mr. Duncan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, you talked about looking at these events with the benefit of hindsight. Two men who did were Peter Boone, who is a researcher at the London School of Economics, and Simon Johnson, a professor at the MIT.
Could the gentleman be closer to the mic so we can hear you? Thank you.
Simon Johnson, a professor at the MIT Sloan School of Management, and they wrote in the New Republic magazine in the September 23rd issue, quote, "The Fed may well have mitigated our current crisis by sowing the seeds for the next one." And they say, in fact, the Fed has exacerbated the possibility of another similar, even larger crisis. In fact, the way they put it, they say, quote, "As a result, unless real reform happens soon, we face the prospect of another bubble burst bailout cycle that will be even more dangerous than the one we've just been through." Now, I assume you know that the American people are very, very angry about these bailouts and the bonuses and the salaries that have come about through this, what most people see as a big government, big business duopoly. And they feel like this big government, big business duopoly has been manipulated in such a way as to allow just mind-boggling salaries and bonuses and allow very few elitists at the top to come out like robber barons or to an extent really not known in American history. Because of big government, through the Federal Reserve System, our free market system was not allowed to operate. And it seems to most of us that it's not capitalism to, when government uses billions and billions of taxpayer money to prop up a very few well-connected firms. Now that leads me to two questions. One, has the Treasury informed any of these financial giants that we will not follow too big to fail policies in the future? And secondly, do you think we should limit these salaries, these ridiculously excessive salaries and bonuses that are even being talked about even today in any of these firms that got taxpayer bailout funds?
Congressman, that was a very thoughtful question. You asked exactly the right question. In a financial crisis, you face this tragic choice. You can let it try to burn itself out and let the damage spread to all sorts of innocent victims, or you can act to prevent it, knowing that acting to prevent it will create the risk that in the future, investors will expect the government to step in the future and save firms from the consequences of failure. That is the dilemma at the heart of strategy in financial crisis. To stand back and let it burn is irresponsible. It's what happened in the Great Depression. It almost happened to this country. The moral, just, pragmatic, fair choice, and this should be true if you're a Republican or a Democrat, is to act to protect the innocent. But, as you said wisely, by definition, that creates the risks we sow the seeds for future crises. And that's why in the financial reform problem we all have a huge stake in trying to make sure we not just limit risk-taking in the future, but that investors and equity holders and creditors and managers and executives do not run these firms with the expectations the government will be there again. And that's why it's so important we put in place types of bankruptcy mechanisms that we have now for banks, but we do not have for institutions like AIG. Now, absolutely, we have made clear in public, in crystal clear terms, in reform proposals that are now moving through the Congress, that we need to end this expectation of too big to fail in government assistance. And if you look at what we have done since we came to office, we have moved very aggressively to pull the government out of these institutions, to make sure we are not in these institutions a day longer than is necessary, to replace the public capital with private capital. And we've done that by forcing disclosure and forcing firms to recapitalize with private money, precisely because we want to limit the scale of the government's involvement and end this exceptional period as quickly as we could. And that strategy has been very, very effective in ways that people on the right and the left should welcome. On the right, it means that the government is out much more quickly than anybody expected. On the left, people should know with confidence now that we have far more resources now available to help address the long-term challenges we face as a country, to reduce our long-term deficits and try to meet the things that we have to do to fix what was broken in this country. But you asked a very good question, and I agree very much with the thrust of your concern.
Well, that was a good answer to my first question, but my second question was, do you think these bonuses and salaries should be limited in any way in these firms that did receive government bailout money?
I think time's expired, but please answer the question.
I think what happened to compensation across this country and in the financial system was terribly catastrophic. It's judged by, it came as in the wave of a huge increase in income inequality in the United States over decades. In the financial system, it was much worse. And it was much more consequential because it helped encourage a level of risk-taking that, again, brought the system to the edge of collapse. So it is deeply important in the public interest of the country that Congress legislate reforms that will change how bankers are paid. Government can't do it alone, though. Shareholders and their representatives on the boards of these firms have to bring about much tougher limits in how firms are paid. I think that's very important to do, and I hope we'll have support from the Congress in making sure we have the basis for doing that.
Thanks, the gentleman. Chair recognizes Mr. Lynch of Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, I'm well aware of your family's commitment to public service, so it makes it more difficult in a sense, but to ask these questions. But I honestly feel that that the conduct of yourself and Mr. Paulson were not consistently on the side of the American taxpayer, and I'll explain why. I'll give you two examples. We had the situation with Bear Stearns. The circumstances are the same. The world is on the brink. We got a disaster. We're worried about the whole system melted down. With your support, Mr. Paulson, Mr. Bernanke, we forced Bear Stearns shareholders from a position, I think that was a high of $172 a share in January. We forced them down to $2 a share because the American taxpayer money was in the bailout. And that was something that was supported by the Fed, by the Treasury, because we felt that because the taxpayer was bailing them out, that the shareholders of Bear Stearns should not be held harmless. Now, you have a different situation here, slightly different. A number of weeks later where we have AIG going under. And these are credit default swaps. So the money going into AIG is going right out to the counterparties. This is a pass-through. And the folks on the other side are Goldman Sachs. Largely, that's a principal beneficiary of all this. And we don't negotiate a nickel, not a cent, off of what they're getting. You're in the same position. You're supposed to be negotiating on behalf of the American people. Now, you're saying, oh, the regulations were different. Let me tell you something. We were changing the rules and regulations every single day. We were taking action, the Fed, under 13.3, under extraordinary circumstances. You had every opportunity to weigh in on behalf of the American people and make these people take a new deal, make them take a haircut. You scalped the folks on Bear Stearns. 2 cents on a dollar they got. 2 cents on a dollar. The folks at Goldman Sachs got 100 cents on a dollar. And that is just unacceptable. Totally unacceptable. You had the opportunity, and, you know, I just think it was a terrible decision on your part, and also on Mr. Paulson's part, and he's up later, and we'll talk to him. But how do you expect to look, and the thing about changing over to the Obama administration, you get the same people who are relying on you. The American taxpayer, when you're in one job, and the American taxpayer is relying on the other job. I don't see a conflict. I really don't. You could have done the right thing by those people, by the American taxpayer, because their money was being put into this deal.
Congressman,
and it just stinks to the high heaven what happened here.
Congressman,
I don't like the obfuscation. And to top it all off, the disclosure was not there. The disclosure was not there at the proper time to tell the American people and tell this Congress what was going on. And that is just inexcusable. And it makes me doubt. It makes me doubt your commitment to the American people. It makes me doubt Mr. Paulson's commitment to the American people. And I think the commitment to Goldman Sachs trumped the responsibility that our officials had to the American people.
Congressman, I respect your opinion. I know you hold those opinions strongly, but I completely disagree. The American taxpayer would not have been better off if the government had made it possible for equity holders in Bear Stearns to get more money. The American taxpayer would not have been better off if we had let AIG default. None of us did anything out of any concern.
There's a difference between giving them 100 cents on a dollar and letting them default. This was a new game. You were creating new facilities every week to help folks.
We were, because
we were letting people go to the discount window that never had an opportunity to do that. We were changing the rules day by day, and we had the banks at a position where we could have exercised a lot of leverage, and you chose not to do it. You chose not to do it.
Right, I disagree with you.
And it doesn't mean we have to pay them 100 cents on the dollar or we let them fail. There are increments here, and we never use that leverage.
Not in this case.
In this case, exactly.
Not
Under
in this case.
13.3, we could have taken different steps than we took here.
13.3 had nothing to do with this in this particular case. What 13.3 was, and this is important for people to understand, 13.3 was authority given to the Federal Reserve to protect the financial system from broad-based runs. It gave us the authority only to lend against collateral to make sure that firms that were solvent could fund. We did that because of the catastrophic damage caused by decades of previous financial crises. We used that authority because we thought there was no other choice.
Look,
and we used that authority appropriately.
Let me just say, I'm reclaiming my time.
Gentlemen,
when Hank Paulson pulled 9 banks into a room and said, "You're taking bailout money," that was extraordinary action. Okay?
The gentleman's time has expired. I must
He
move
could have
on.
done the same thing, negotiating a better rate on behalf of the American taxpayer. I yield back.
If it would have been possible, we would have done it.
Yeah.
Why would I want to be sitting here before you today, having to defend actions that look like they could have been avoided? There is nobody who was part of that decision that would not have done that if it would have been possible. I try to be as careful as I can in explaining the reasons why it was not possible, but it comes down to this basic tragic choice. If you are prepared to default, you can impose haircuts. If you can't accept the consequences of default, you do not have any leverage. It would have been vastly more expensive to the American taxpayer. It would have been much more damaging to people you and I care about, people you and I wake up every day worrying about, if we had let that firm fail. There was no choice between default and the restructuring of those contracts, and they left the taxpayer
There was
better
no
off.
shared sacrifice, no shared sacrifice for Goldman Sachs and the American people.
But the gentleman from Massachusetts yield. The gentleman's time has expired, and I now call on Mr. Turner from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Geithner, in an answer to one of my colleagues, you previously stated that you had never been a politician. I want to assure you from your answers today that you are absolutely a politician. And let me tell you one of the examples.
Do you mean that as a compliment or not? I can't tell.
Let me tell you one of the answers that trouble me about the issue in your written testimony of the team concluded AIG's failure would be catastrophic. You go on to talk about the insurance arms of AIG. Now, this is not the first hearing that this committee has had or other committees. And you know that we're aware of the independence of the insurance arms of AIG. We've got Morris Greenberg, a former chairman of the CEO of AIG, said, to the best of my knowledge, the problems that came to a head this year did not originate in AIG's insurance businesses, which remain fundamentally strong. We had the head of the New York State Insurance Department, Superintendent Eric Dinalo, came in and said this: before I go further, I would like to make one critical point. It is important for everyone, and especially policyholders in AIG insurance companies, to understand that the insurance companies, which are regulated by New York and other states, are solvent and have the funds to pay any policyholders' claims. They had independent reserves. You did not bail out the insurance companies of AIG, correct? They didn't need it. You bailed out the parent, right?
Yes,
so when
but
we go
if the
through,
parent had
so
defaulted...
when we go through your answer of if AIG had failed, the catastrophic effect of all of the insurance companies that were on AIG, they weren't bailed out by you.
No, that's not true. But maybe this is helpful to go back a little bit. When AIG came to us that weekend, remember, the Fed is not their regulator. Fed had no responsibility, authority over how they ran their business. That was the province of other regulators. It was inconceivable to me that this was a problem we were going to have to try to solve. And we got all the people we could, including the New York State Insurance Commissioner and his staff, other people, to look at and explain to us.
Did you bail out the life insurance arms of AIG?
Those insurance companies...
Did you bail out the life insurance arms of AIG?
Well, again, I wouldn't use that term. The actions we took helped
Did you bail
prevent...
out the health insurance arm of AIG?
Well, again, the actions we took to prevent default of the firm protected those companies
Mr. Geithner,
from the risk of failure.
The testimony we've received previously from those who were looking at those arms was that they were substantially sound, and so the catastrophic effects that you list certainly are something that we would all have been concerned about.
I disagree completely. The people can look at this and they can come to different judgments, but the people who were responsible for looking at those insurance companies, frankly, had no idea of the risks with firms' term, and you could not separate those companies from the companies that had taken terrible risks. The tragic thing in the structure of the company was they were so closely linked they couldn't separate them. Why would we have not? If it had been possible to separate the place that was taking the firm down, to separate that cleanly, separate that from those, we would have done that in a second. And in fact, much of what the management of this firm is trying to do today still, 15 months later, is designed to achieve that objective. But they were tightly connected. They could not have been separated. And the insurance supervisors who were responsible for the individual firm did not know the extent to which the financial basis of the insurance companies was so connected to the holding company and the AIFP that had taken all those risks.
Well, Mr. Secretary, as you were going through the bailouts and as we looked to the counterparties and the funds that were received, one of the biggest concerns that I've had through all of this process is that I believe that when it all becomes public, and it hasn't all become public yet because we don't have everything from you, that this may turn out to be the largest theft in history, that there were parties that were participating in through mortgage-backed securities and through the credit default swaps into defrauding Mr. and Mrs. American citizen on Main Street who was receiving a loan on their home that was negative in loan-to-value ratio and also had a greater risk than was being reported as the mortgage-backed securities and credit default swaps were passed up the chain. Do you have any information that of AIG knowing that the loan-to-value ratios were inflated and that the risks were being understated? Because I truly believe that throughout this system that brought down the systematic mortgage crisis system in the process, that there was a significant amount of defrauding going on and that people need to be held accountable. And I don't think in your system where you're bailing out, you're taking into consideration those that were bad actors.
I completely agree that this country allowed, under the laws of the land, a terrible erosion in underwriting standards, a terrible amount of predation and abusive practices in mortgage lending and consumer finance. We should never have let that happen. And I hope you will join with us in trying to pass reforms that will prevent that from happening.
But in your bailouts,
the gentleman's time. Hold a second. Let me just say something to all the members. Right now, we have like 30-some members that still did not have an opportunity to question. So we're going to have to stick to the time. So I want you to respect that. I mean, I noticed that a couple of situations where you're going over, but I'm saying to you that when the red light comes on, that's it. So, so I want you to know we're now moving to Mr. Quigley of Ohio. Illinois, I'm sorry. Mr. Quigley of Illinois, is he here? Ms. Capture of Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, welcome. Can you provide for the record a copy of the recusal agreement that you signed when you were at the New York Fed?
I did not sign a recusal agreement. I withdrew from day-to-day management operations policy uses of the New York Fed, and my colleagues, both in Washington and in New York, can attest to that.
So there was no formal agreement?
No, as I said in my testimony, what I did is I withdrew from, and this was very important to do. Again, no precedent for this, a sitting president of the New York Fed being nominated to be Secretary of the Treasury. And I withdrew from, after carefully consulting my colleagues, from involvement in monetary policy decisions. I did not go to the FOMC meeting in December, and I withdrew from all decisions about these individual cases involving the financial system and from day-to-day management. And that was the right thing to do at that time.
Thank you for clarifying that. Number two, a lot of people think that the president of the New York Fed works for the U.S. government. But in fact, you work for the private banks that elected you.
No, that is not true.
Can you provide, for the record, the names of the handful of bankers on the board of the New York Fed that elected you in 2003, please?
That is a matter of public record.
It was 2003?
And of course we can do that.
Thank you very much.
But, Congresswoman, can I just say, what you just said was not true. I work in the public interest. Officials of the Federal Reserve work for the public interest, and they work for the government.
But the people don't elect you. The heads of the Feds around the country don't elect you. It's the individuals who sit on the board of the New York Fed that elect you. Is that correct?
It's slightly more complicated than that. What the Congress did in setting up the Fed is set up a system where the presidents of the regional reserve banks are elected by their board, but it requires the approval of the chairman of the Board of Governors in Washington for them to serve. So it is a delicate balance of checks and balances, and Congress designed that system.
But it is largely private banks that elected you, and I would like you to provide that for the record, please.
Oh, absolutely. That's a matter of public record.
The Cleveland Fed is not equal to the New York Fed, so I'm very interested in your answer to the record. Number three. Goldman Sachs was the largest domestic recipient of funds in this AIG counterparty arrangement. Let me ask you, now as Treasury Secretary, your Chief of Staff is the gatekeeper for access to you. Could you please provide his name?
His name is Mark Patterson.
Thank you. And for whom did he work before you selected him as your Chief of Staff?
He worked for the President's transition team.
No, before that. Which Wall Street firm did he work for?
And before that, again, this is a matter of public record, and you know the answer to this question. He worked for Goldman Sachs. But
thank you very much. You answered my question, Mr. Secretary. Now let me say this: the AIG transaction. You have answered the question.
No, what you're doing is
you've answered the question. Thank you. The AIG transaction was disturbing to many observers. Why did our government not require the bank creditors to take the lead and bear some of the cost in any plan to stabilize AIG? You, in effect, nationalized the company and let the bank creditors off the hook. Why did you, as president of the New York Fed, not work out an arrangement to remove the London unit from the company rather than allowing the unit to infect the entire company?
If we had had the types of bankruptcy procedures we have for banks, it is possible that ultimately we could have done that. And if it would have been easy and cheaper for the taxpayer for us to separate the riskiest parts of the firm from the healthy, profitable insurance companies, we would do that. And in fact, that is the core of the restructuring strategy the company is now undertaking. But that choice was not available to us at the time. If it had been possible, of course we would have done that. But because we did not have the tools that we have under bankruptcy, we did not have that choice.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Your phone logs from the subpoenaed material this committee requested, which I would like to insert in the record, show between September 14th and November 26th. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The critical period when the bailout occurred And just after September 15th, when the three major rating agencies downgraded AIG's credit rating, you made hundreds of calls, and the most, over 225, to Secretary Paulson, who was then Secretary of Treasury. What firm did he work for prior to his appointment as Secretary of Treasury?
He worked for Goldman Sachs.
He worked for Goldman Sachs. Now, Goldman Sachs, as I understand it, got the most in counterparty payments of any domestic institution. Is that true, $14 billion?
I actually don't know if it's that true, but that's a matter of public record.
Societe Generale got the most from an international firm, but Goldman Sachs was number one. Now, you made about 100 calls to Fed Chair Ben Bernanke, but then the next highest number of calls in that period, you made 103 to a man named Dan Jester. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll end. May I just ask, what firm did he work for?
He worked, as you know, he worked for Goldman Sachs.
Thank you, and I will have additional questions with regard to who you phoned, and we will place that in the record. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, can I just say one thing in response to this? I just want to say it's very important. Congressman, you were suggesting that the people that were involved in this were not acting in the public interest, and you were suggesting that they were working for the private interest, not the public interest. And that is not true. I would never, and I believe none of those individuals would be ever part of any decision like that. And I think these people were people of enormous integrity and experience operating under exceptional circumstances with no precedent, doing the best they could for what was in the public interest. And I think it's important to say for the record,
I must move. Gentleman from Georgia, Congressman Westmoreland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Geithner, when did AIG, if you could just give us a date, when did AIG call and say we need some money?
Well, they came to Treasury and the Fed formally, I think, on that Friday.
What, Friday?
Which was, I think it was the, well, the calendar will show. It was the Friday in September, the 11th or the 12th, I think.
Okay, so it was a Friday in September. Yeah. And at the time, there were advisors of AIG that were also advising the New York Fed. Were you aware of any conflicts amongst these advisors, or were there any discussions about what kind of conflict this might bring about?
Well, when AIG came to us and started to try to walk us through their financial condition, they had advisors with them, and they were also in discussion with other advisors that were not with us in the room at that time.
When did that dollar amount become, after the discussions, at what point in time did a dollar amount derived at?
You mean the initial terms of the initial loan?
The initial.
I think that we reached that decision probably just on the eve of the formal agreement.
Okay.
I mean, we you know, again, we were trying to do.
And what would that date have been? Do you remember that
Well,
date?
it would have been, you know, the 16th was when we concluded this transaction, so it would have been just before that.
Let me ask, on the counterparties, when was that meeting with the counterparties to discuss what the payment might be to them? Do you remember those dates?
I do not believe there was a meeting with counterparties. What I asked my colleagues to do, after looking at a range of options, is to approach the counterparties individually and try to negotiate concessions.
So there was no actual meeting where all the counterparties were in a room?
I don't think, I'd have to check the record. I'd be happy to check the record and get back to you, but I do not believe that my colleagues at New York Fed brought them in a room together.
So when you say your colleagues, these are people that actually worked for you, they were under your direction?
Absolutely, and they acted in my direction.
Yes, sir. So you were aware of the 100% payment to the counterparties?
As I've said many times, we decided, and I fully supported,
I understand.
The decision to...
That's a yes.
Yes, that's a yes.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Now, in each one of these meetings with the counterparties to negotiate, we weren't able to negotiate any of them down?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the hardest thing.
And I mean, these were separate meetings, I guess. I mean, did you question the negotiating skills of some of these people?
No, these were, again, these were very talented people with a lot of experience who knew how to do this. Many had done this for a living. But again, unless you can threaten default or threaten to pay below par, you understand this, you don't have any leverage in a transaction. And in fact, if we had negotiated with the threat of default like that, our concern was that would risk a downgrade, would have brought about the collapse of the fund.
Do you know if AIG had approached any of these people about any type of negotiations about what a sum may have been? Because once the government gets behind it, it like you said, it takes away your negotiating
You're
skill.
exactly right. You're exactly right. And I don't know, I'm not sure, but I think that if I'm not mistaken, AIG had probably tried to do that before the government came in, but I can't speak to that today.
But these people with these credit default swaps, they were all bright people. They knew the high risk of what they were getting involved with, did they not? I mean,
well, you know, the tragic lesson of this crisis is lots of bright people with lots of experience who should have known better made bets on the future of the country that assumed house prices would never fall. And the judgments AIG made were very similar to the mistakes the rating agencies made.
but these people were making a lot of money off of this. I mean, this was a high-risk, high-reward business, right?
Oh, you mean the people at AIG? Oh, yes, absolutely.
Yeah. It's obvious that AIG deal is a bad deal for the taxpayers. And is this deal being renegotiated? And is anybody at the Treasury working with AIG to try to renegotiate this deal?
Right. It is Congressman, it is a better deal for the taxpayer than the alternatives, and it's proving in many ways far better than many of us thought, although, as I said, the U.S. government is still exposed to substantial risk of loss. But we have a new board in place.
But just answer, because
Yes.
I got one more question. But
Gentleman's time has expired. And of course, the gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your testimony. As you indicated, the previous administration came to Congress and to the country and said we faced an extraordinary circumstance, that failure to act to help rescue the financial industry would hurt people on Main Street, innocent bystanders in this process. And you took the action that you did, and you properly said that we need to learn the lessons from what happened. And the administration and the Congress have been working to do just that. Here in the House, we already passed a Wall Street accountability bill to try and do two things. Number one, provide the Fed and others with the tools to make sure you don't have a situation where a firm becomes too big to fail in a manner that it hurts innocent people. Second, to make sure that there's a fail-safe. If somehow that happens, there's a pool of money raised from the banks, not from the taxpayers, to pay for the rescue. And number three, and the President has proposed this, a fee on the biggest financial institutions, $50 billion plus in assets, to recover every penny of TARP money. And I think it's important to understand, everyone understand, that includes every penny extended to AIG and every penny extended to the counterparties. Now, in the House, we passed a bill, and we had an amendment to that bill offered by Congressman Gary Peters of Michigan. I've got it right here. And it says that that fee will remain on the biggest banks, not just to capitalize a fund to be used in the event of future problems that they have to pay for their own, but it says you keep that fee on until you recover every penny. And I must say, I was surprised. I wish all our colleagues on the other side of the aisle were here. I was surprised that this very simple idea was rejected unanimously by the other side in a vote we had on this. And that vote would have ensured, it passed, but that was a vote to make sure that we get back every penny that the taxpayer gave to AIG, every penny that the taxpayer gave to the counterparties. So if you could just speak to the importance of making sure, number one, we take measures to prevent this from happening in the future, but just as importantly, making sure we let everybody on Main Street that their money that they helped sent to rescue the package will be recovered if we adopt the proposal in the House and the President's proposal.
If Congress joins the President in adopting this proposed financial fee, then the American taxpayer will not be exposed to a penny of loss for everything the government had to do to fix this mess in AIG or everywhere else. That is not enough, though. We believe it is very important to make sure we work with Congress to put in place constraints that would prevent this from happening again. It was a tragic failure of the country not to act sooner to limit risk-taking by some of the largest institutions in the world that were operating with not enough capital and no oversight. And we have to make it clear in the future that we are going to be able to let firms fail without costing the taxpayers money and without causing collateral damage. Now, Mr. Van Hollen, I just want to say one thing. The cost of the American people cannot be captured in the simple financial costs of the TARP. We will protect them from those costs if Congress passes this fee. But the costs of the crisis are much more damaging, cause much more damage. It can never be captured by the accounting costs of the losses under TARP. But we have a great responsibility and obligation to reform the system so they're not in that position again. And the least we can do is to make sure that the taxpayers aren't bearing the direct costs that we took in AIG, forced to take in AIG and elsewhere.
Some of these bad decisions obviously went beyond just the amount of and are continuing to take actions to fight the economy back on the right track. I just think it's important that if we adopt the amendment the House has taken as a matter of final law, or the President's proposal, which is very similar, that the monies that have been subject to the conversation today about the taxpayers sent to AIG and then went to the counterparties will be fully recouped and returned to the federal treasury on behalf of the taxpayers.
That's exactly right, and it's better than that, though, Congressman, because the specific transaction that is subject of so much attention appropriately in this hearing themselves are likely to earn the taxpayer a modest profit. But the government is still exposed to some risk of loss on the rest of its investments. But if we adopt this fee, the taxpayers will not bear a penny of that cost.
Thank you, Secretary.
Me.
Chair recognizes Mr. McHenry.
Thank you. Just to be clear, there's $68 billion worth of loss, $30.4 billion associated with this AIG deal we're talking about now. So there's significant loss to the taxpayers already through TARP, and so this new tax is simply about making up for that revenue. Mr. Secretary, do you support H.R. 4173, the Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act?
Congressman, I'm not sure of the precise legislative amendment you're citing.
No, it's not an amendment. It's a bill sponsored by Barney Frank of Massachusetts, the chairman. Is this
the comprehensive financial reform law that passed the House in December?
Yes.
Yes, I support that.
You support that. Okay. And do you support the Volcker rule?
Absolutely. What the President proposed is that working with the bill that passed the House, which included a provision that I think Mr. Kanjorski authored to give the government the ability to limit risk-taking by banks, that we make sure those translate into limits that will actually prevent risk-taking in the future.
So it's consistent with H.R. 4173?
Absolutely. That bill, and this is very important for people to understand, that bill included
I understand. I'm on the committee.
Yeah, included a provision that would give the government the ability to limit risk-taking in a way that helped prevent future crises.
Wasn't it your legislative staff that really worked to change the Kanjorski amendment?
Well, again, we work closely with members of that committee on a whole range of those provisions to make sure that they met the intent.
No, you're not answering my question.
Oh, on that amendment, absolutely, we work with them on that amendment.
You worked with them on that amendment,
but on all provisions
to limit it in terms of its reach.
No, we worked on it to limit to make sure that it was going to work.
Okay. So, in essence, the Volcker rule is something you support?
Yes.
Okay. You testified last month before the Joint Economic Committee, quote, I would not support reinstating Glass-Steagall, and I don't actually believe that the end of Glass-Steagall played a significant role in the cause of this crisis. Do you still stand by that statement?
Absolutely.
How do you reconcile that belief with this rule that, in essence, limits or forces banks to divest in hedge funds and private equity and all these other additional elements that is, in essence, Glass-Steagall?
No, well, what Glass-Steagall did was to allow banks to underwrite equities and to engage in a whole range of other types of financial activities, insurance as well.
It limited that ability,
and
to be clear.
And we support, as I think the bill that you cited did support, it did actually provide authority to limit a set of activities so that the access to the safety net is not subsidizing excessive risk-taking. It's a simple principle.
I know it's
does it dial back some of the Graham-Leach-Blyer reforms? It does do that.
Okay,
but it is not what people typically refer to as Glass-Steagall.
Okay, so it also says that if you engage in a certain type of, if you have a certain form, meaning a bank holding company, you have to adhere to certain rules, correct?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. You also testified before the Financial Services Committee, of which I said last year, that, quote, financial products and institutions should be regulated by the economic function they provide and the risks they present, not the legal form they take.
That's right. I agree with that.
And so you support a rule that says, based on a legal form you take, you have to adhere to these principles. How do you reconcile this?
They're perfectly consistent, but let me state the basic principle again.
They're perfectly opposite.
No, what we're saying is, and this is very important for people to understand, if you are operating in the financial markets, you're helping companies raise credit, raise capital. You're helping make markets work. You're providing liquidity to markets. It doesn't matter, it shouldn't matter to us or the American people, whether you're called Goldman Sachs or whether you're called JP Morgan. You should be subjected to a set of constraints on capital, on leverage, on how you're funded that limit the amount of risks you take. If in addition to that, you want to own a bank and operate a bank, then there are a set of other limits that we think are good in the public interest so that, again, you can't take advantage of that access to the safety net to subsidize a set of activities that are not essential to.
But basically you're saying if you just simply drop the bank holding company label, you're out from under those
Absolutely not, and that would be a mistake for the country. Our view is
that's actually what the one-page rule that.
No, it does not. It does not do that. It's not a fair reading of the rule. But Congressman, maybe this would be helpful for me to say to you. We will work very closely with members on both sides of the aisle to make sure that this legislation results in a set of sensible constraints and risk-taking.
That would be something new.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Over the last 13 months, because you have not reached out to Republicans, to be clear, on the financial services.
That is not true, but again, I'm happy going forward to make sure that as we try to give these force of law, reflect them in regulation, we do so carefully with full consultation.
The gentleman's time has expired, and the chairman recognizes himself for 5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Geithner, for being here. Number one, I just want to remind my colleagues on both sides that the whole request for the bailout that had to be administered by the Treasury Department was at the request of then-President Bush. And second, I understand your testimony that the people responsible for administering this made the best decisions they could under the circumstances. I just want to ask a couple of questions, though, that start with one of the statements you made, Mr. Geithner, about the effect of the actions taken has stabilized the financial system. I'm not here to argue that. The question I have is, has it helped the broad Main Street economy? And there are many who believe, and I'm among them, that Wall Street got out ahead of itself, got in the business of self-enrichment rather than financing American jobs, American entrepreneurs, and actually transformed itself from an entity that was about creating jobs into the greatest job-killing machine in the history of the country. There's two things that I want to ask. One is the bank fee that President Obama has endorsed. Do you see that as essential to have the folks who were largely responsible for the financial meltdown pay the cost so that it is not the taxpayers? Is that correct?
Absolutely. In the reforms we proposed to the Congress back in June, at the center of that proposal was a basic principle, which in the future, governments exposed to risk of loss,
right,
the banks pay. In the TARP legislation you referred to, there's an explicit provision there that puts an obligation on me to propose ways to coop the costs, and we propose that in the President's financial responsibility.
All right, and I support that. I'm glad you're doing it. Second, There are a number of us, well over 60, that are supporting a tax on Wall Street bonuses. And I just want to get your opinion on this, and I'll give an example of the kind of conduct that was allowed to occur. It's been reported, as you know, in the New York Times that Goldman Sachs had a department that bundled subprime mortgages. It then had folks who advocated to the rating agencies to give it the highest rating possible. It then went to its trusted clients and sold those, and then it went to its trading desk and sold them short. Is that the type of conduct that you think should be monitored and curbed by any financial regulatory monitor?
Congressman, I believe deeply that we need tougher rules enforced more effectively and evenly to make sure that consumers and investors are not taken advantage of, and the system is not so fragile. Government has to step in the future and take this enormous risk of loss.
Okay, let me get to
believe that.
Let me just ask you about the bonus tax, because I'd be interested in this. Firms like Goldman receive TARP funds. They receive low-interest money from the open window of the Federal Reserve. Goldman and other firms received direct pass-through payments when AIG was bailed out, correct? And when Mr. Paulson, your predecessor, was on the phone requesting this money, this was not anything that you made the request for. He assured us that Wall Street had learned its ways. Goldman and the other Wall Street firms are back to their old ways. They've been so successful, and let's give them credit. They're good at what they do. The question is whether what they do is good for the economy and for Main Street. They've been able to set aside $140 to $160 billion. Do you have an opinion for bonuses? And they could have lent that out. They could have added to their capital base. And the third choice was they could put it in their pockets, which is the one they have chosen. Do you think, in view of the fact that much of their profit was made through taxpayer generosity, it would be appropriate to tax bonuses, as I suggest in my legislation, at 50% above $50,000?
Congressman, of course, I would be happy to take a careful look at that legislation and talk to you about how best to deal with that. The basic principle that we support fully is to make sure that the American taxpayer is not exposed to a penny of losses from the actions the government had to take under the TARP authority. And I completely agree, as I said earlier, that we need to work with the Congress to make sure we bring about fundamental changes in how bankers are paid so that they are not taking risks that could imperil the economy as a whole. Doing that is hard to do right. We've tried in the past, not very successfully. It's an obligation that shareholders have and boards have too, but it is the government's responsibility in the end to make sure we're
my time's almost up. Where we would take the money that was raised from that and put it into small business lending. And as you know, the big banks that receive TARP funds have reduced lending to American enterprise. And folks in Vermont who run businesses ask me, if those guys make so much money, how come they can't lend me any?
I agree. And I think if you saw in the paper today, we are close to proposing to the Congress that we take a large amount of the resources that we've gotten back from banks, from the large banks, and devote them to exactly that objective, to trying to make sure that small banks and small businesses have access to credit.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. My time is up. And the Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being with us today. Now, Mr. Secretary, you were involved, you've said this many times, involved with the decision 15, 18 months ago relative to the initial TARP bailout. You were involved in all that. You thought it was the right decision to make at the time.
Sorry,
coming to Congress asking for the $700 billion.
Oh, I thought it was absolutely essential at that point. Country had no choice.
And this committee has had several hearings on the Bank of America Merrill Lynch, and you were involved in that decision. We have emails that talked about, you were in the loop, you knew what was going on there, you were supportive of what took place with the merger of, with the acquisition of Merrill by Bank of America. Yes or no?
Well, that is right, that at that time, I was part of an effort to try to find a solution, private solution, to Merrill Lynch at that point, and I thought that action at the time was necessary and appropriate, yes.
And today you have said that, you think the initial decision relative to AIG and the payment to the counterparties, you think that was appropriate. You've stated that strongly in your written testimony. You talk about this is in the best interest of the American people.
I do.
We did not act to help foreign banks. We acted because the consequences of failing at that time in those circumstances would have been catastrophic to our economy, American families, and American businesses. You think it was definitely the right decision?
I do.
And the staff that worked for you at the New York Fed would be in agreement with that analysis, that this was so critical, this had to get done. the sky was going to fall, the world was going to end if we did not do what you decided to do relative to the counterparties and the $62 billion that was spent. Is that correct?
I believe it is, but I think there are, to be fair to say, there were those among us involved in this, in each of the institutions involved, Washington, New York Treasury, who were deeply troubled by that choice, were not comfortable with this.
We're comfortable with it, but you thought it was what you had to do at the time.
I believe that, yes.
And it was so important, as you've said in your written and your testimony here this morning, your oral testimony, that this was critical to American families, American businesses. So
I believe that.
It begs the obvious question. Why the secrecy relative to disclosure? If it's that important, $62 billion, why in the heck not disclose it when it's happening, since you've subsequently done that? Why the secrecy? And frankly, why weren't you involved? If it's that critical, if it's that important, why in the heck did you recuse yourself? Why weren't you involved?
Well, again, just to step back a sec, when the Fed disclosed this in March of 2009, I thought it was the right thing to do. And I think reasonable people looking back at this could say, why wasn't that possible sooner? I think that's a reasonable conclusion.
Why wasn't it possible in November when it was all going down?
Right, but all I can say is what I understand and was involved in, and I was not involved in decisions about what to do with that particular transaction, the counterparties or the details. And that's because
Well, let me ask you this. Do you believe the decision that was made by the folks who work for you at the New York Fed to not disclose until March and not disclose when it was all taking place, do you support that decision?
Congressman, as I said,
it's a yes or no. I mean, you've said you're for transparency. You said this was so critical, the world was going to end, everything was going to go to,
Let me tell you something. Let me tell you something I deeply believe. Okay, it is very hard to put yourself in shoes you did not occupy, and have really a fair sense to evaluate those actions in that case. And I don't feel like I can put myself in their shoes at that time.
Let me tell you what I think happened.
But I do believe that they acted with great integrity, care, and judgment.
Here's what happened. Here's what happened. Mr. Lynch was on the right trail over here. I mean, this is a pattern. We've seen it. You came to the Congress of the United States. You said, "Give us $700 billion of taxpayer money."
I did not do that.
No, I'm saying the government. The government came to the Congress and said, "Give us $700
Your government. Your president at that time.
I understand. I mean, I didn't say Democrat or Republican. I understand the government. Give us the money. We're going to go buy the troubled assets. They didn't do that. 9 days later, 10 days later, as Mr. Lynch put it out, you were in the room when they told the 9 biggest banks, we're not going to buy the troubled assets, you're going to take the TARP money.
And that was one of the best decisions, one of the most important decisions.
But understand the pattern. The Congress of the United States was told one thing, 10 days later, an entirely different action was taking place.
I don't think that's actually correct. What Congress authorized
You don't think the Congress passed that bill because they understood that the money that the taxpayers were going to put up was going to be used to buy troubled assets?
Well, as I said, I can't put myself in your shoes, but I think the salient point is the authority that President Bush asked for gave my predecessor the authority to put capital in banks. And doing that was
Here's the pattern, Mr. Geithner. Mr. Secretary, here's the pattern. The government comes to the taxpayer and says, we need more of your money, we need a boatload of your money, the world's going to end, we're going to do it, we want it for a specific purpose, then they do it for something else. Then they come to the taxpayers, we need more of your money, and we're going to use $62 billion of dollars, and they don't disclose to the taxpayer what's going on. This is why we never should have traveled down this road. This unprecedented involvement by the government in the private sector. We've seen it we've seen it with the initial TARP, we've seen it with Bank of America Merrill Lynch, we've seen it now with AIG. I thank the Chairman.
Okay. The gentleman's time has expired. Thank you. The Chair recognizes Mr. Clay.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank Chairman Towns and Mr. Isser for conducting this hearing. Secretary Geithner, several economists and policy makers assert that AIG's ability to provide cash collateral to their counterparties was not relevant in designing their assistance package. What is your opinion on this claim, that it was not relevant in designing the assistance?
I agree that what was relevant and necessary was how to restructure this firm in ways to protect the taxpayer to the extent we could from the risk of greater losses. And our choice was, at that point, this very stark, tragic choice, which is to let AIG default or not. And we thought that default itself would have been much more expensive.
Okay, let me help me and help help the American people understand. Why was AIG's ability to make payments to its counterparties for their toxic assets even a factor in determining the amount of bailout money to award them?
For an insurance company or any financial institution to operate, they need to be able to operate with a high credit rating. Without that, they could not borrow money to function. They could not write insurance contracts because people would not believe they would have the financial wherewithal to back those commitments. So the rating is critical. If we were to have defaulted on any of those legal contracts, AIG would have been downgraded. The counterparties would have the right to take more money and to default on and to bring about the basic collapse of the firm. So it's that stark, tragic choice. If the AIG had not paid, they would have lost the rating and the firms would have collapsed. The firm would have collapsed. If we had continued to lend the money for them to make those payments, the rating would have also been in jeopardy because AIG already had a lot of debt at that point. So the choice was, again, to restructure them so that we limited the drain of cash and left the taxpayer with any potential positive return on those underlying securities.
So you are saying that the counterparties would have had a right through bankruptcy,
a legal right to sue to recoup that claim.
Okay, did anyone involved in the concession negotiations ever suggest that AIG's counterparties should not be relevant in their bailout package? Did that issue ever arise among the negotiations or anyone that you encountered during the negotiations?
That's a complicated question, good question, but as I try to explain in the testimony, what we were guided by, what was going to be the best way at least cost to prevent default and protect the system. And the entire system was at stake then. And no firm in the country would have been insulated fully from the collapse of the entire American financial system. And our judgment was that AIG's default would have materially raised the probability of that broader collapse. So again, our choices were terrible choices, but they came down to what was the best way to prevent that outcome on the best terms for the taxpayer.
Okay, so then that gets to the point of being too big to fail. AIG's tentacles were that widespread throughout the country and the world?
There are two, it's exactly the right question. There are two things that mattered in this case. One is you had a set of firms like AIG, huge, risky, spread everywhere, involved in a whole range of things. And you had a world that was burning. So again, the first time since the Great Depression, you had financial systems around the world really at the brink of stopping in their tracks. And it's those two conditions that are most risky. If the world had been stable, everything had been fine, we weren't on the edge of the worst recession in generations, then we could have been afforded to be completely indifferent to the fate of AIG or all those institutions. But because AIG was so large and so interconnected, and because the system was so fragile, it would have been irresponsible to take the risk that failure would have dramatically amplified the pressures that we're still living with today.
Could you help describe what the reaction was in negotiations to the counterparties' pros and cons, as far as you know, paying counterparties?
Well, we wrestled with lots of choices, as I try to explain in my written testimony. We thought about whether it was better to default, to impose a haircut, to negotiate concessions under threat of default. We thought about keep paying and watching that money keep running out the door with the counterparty still holding the underlying assets. We thought about negotiating over time, trying to stretch it out, see if we could find a better way to solve that problem. Yes. None of those options were realistic. None of them were feasible. They were not better than the choice we chose. And again, I think if you look back and you take a fair reading of this, although the government is still exposed to substantial risk of loss, those losses are much lower today because of the actions we took in AIG, And this transaction, which, again, people are so understandably concerned about, has put the taxpayer in a better position than if simply we kept making those payments or if we defaulted on them.
Thank you, Mr.
Gentleman's time
Secretary,
has
for your
expired.
response.
I now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from California, Congressman Bill Bray.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. You know, we're supposed to do oversight and reform, so we're trying to get the information so that we can do the reform to make sure the next time this process comes up, we have procedures and laws that address this. And so it's real important that we identify how this went so we can try to correct it and make sure it doesn't happen again. Not only in March, you knew that there was a so-called disclosure issue. But in February, you had said in a speech that one of the major issues that you were concerned about is the lack of disclosure that was causing the American people not to trust the system. Now, I think we'll all agree that in layman's terms, with the average citizen, when they heard disclosure issue, they hear cover-up. Now, why in a system that's supposed to be open, the American people have a right to know where their money goes. Why was there even a disclosure issue? Why were we even discussing the so-called cover-up of the $160 billion, where it was going in this process? Why was that even an issue that as soon as you knew that there was a problem there, that somebody didn't clarify this? Was that your staff had basically did not inform you that there had been this cover-up, this disclosure issue? And did you make that decision, or was that decision made outside? Because AIG sent the information over. It was an internal process within the government itself that said, we're not going to disclose to the public this information.
My colleagues at the New York Fed, I think, have put in the public domain a very thoughtful explanation of the judgments they wrestled with and ultimately reached. And I know, and I'm confident, that their colleagues in Washington spent a huge amount of time throughout those months trying to wrestle with how to meet the understandable public interest in greater disclosure of these things. And they ultimately, I think appropriately, came to the decision that they could and should put that information in the public domain. Now, you're exactly right. I have been a great proponent of greater transparency, and the centerpiece of the strategy that we adopted to fix this mess in the financial system was to force the largest banks in the country to disclose for the first time to the public, to all investors, the scale of losses they might face in the event this recession was much more damaging than it proved to be. And that provided the basis for private investors judging who was strong, who was less strong, and deciding to put in capital into those institutions.
Were you told, in other words, did your staff know the cover-up was there, disclosure issue was there before you knew it was there? Was the decision to
again, I don't. I think again, as the record the committee's already put in the public domain shows, there were discussions that were happening about what to disclose when throughout that period of time.
Were you involved in those discussions?
As I said in my thing, I'll say it again. I played no role in decisions about what to disclose about these transactions to these individual counterparties.
Did your staff make the decision not to inform you or include you in that decision-making process?
Yes, they did, although I made the decision.
Would you want to know about that, or would you prefer that you didn't know about it at the time?
I think in retrospect, I wish I'd known, frankly. But after November 24th, I appropriately removed myself from decisions about a whole range of policy issues the Fed was dealing with. But the people that were making those decisions, in close consultation with people in Washington and with legal counsel, are people of great judgment, enormous integrity, and I have enormous trust and confidence, not just in their judgment, but in the quality decisions they made throughout that period of time.
Do you feel today that at the time that they made the decision to do the cover-up, the disclosure issue, that they felt you did not want to know about it at the time? You think they made a decision
I do not. In my entire time there, I was never aware of a situation in which my colleagues sought to shield me from something consequential. I was president of the New York Fed. I was going to be accountable for decisions made on my watch. But after the 24th, for reasons that I think are fair and right for the institution, I could no longer run those day-to-day judgments. And I withdrew from those, and I think those were necessary. Now,
and your staff decided to shield you from the cover-up side of it, too?
No, I decided that I would withdraw myself from. I didn't decide this alone. I decided this in consultation with the chairman of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System and with the incoming administration to protect the institution from the unique condition that I was in then.
Mr. Secretary, what date did you know that there was a cover-up, a disclosure issue? When were you informed?
I only knew about these discussions about disclosure when they started to be in the public domain. I actually don't know when they first rose to the attention of the Congress, but when they rose to the attention of the Congress and they were in the press, then I was aware of them.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Let me thank you, Secretary Geithner, for your testimony, and of course, we
Mr.
will
Chairman.
now.
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I would ask unanimous consent that all members be allowed to put their questions in writing to the Secretary, and would ask the Secretary if he would respond to them in writing, since so many members are not able to ask their questions.
Without objection, so ordered. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Mr. Chairman, I'm not sure what the right point of order here is, but I recognize how tremendously busy the Secretary is, but I also recognize the need for this Congress and people on both sides of the aisle to be able to ask some questions. We've been waiting patiently here all day. I would hope that the Chairman would do what's necessary.
Let me say what the problem is. You know, I'm one that, as you know, and you've been here long enough now to really know me, because I believe in openness and I believe in going as long as it takes. But Mr. Paulson has a problem with his schedule in terms of the amount of time that he would be allowed. So if we continue, then he will not be able to testify. So I think that's the issue that we have to deal with. So that's the reason why we're cutting it, because and it was agreed that this would happen. And of course, I understand that there's several people that did not have an opportunity to raise questions. But what I would suggest is that you put the questions to the Secretary in writing, and he will answer. Because if not, then the second witness we will not be able to hear from at all. And I think that,
Mr. Chairman, if I could be so bold, my guess is if we were to survey or talk to the people on this the panel, particularly people that haven't had a chance to ask questions, I think, with all due respect, we'd much rather hear from the current Treasury Secretary than the past Treasury Secretary, whose schedule is probably a little bit more flexible than the current Treasury.
I understand that, but the point of the matter is that we have a hearing that's been scheduled, and of course it's been structured, and I wish we could sort of stay here and allow everybody to do that. But the point is that I think in this situation,
Mr. Chairman,
I'd be delighted to yield to the gentleman again. Yes.
And I appreciate it, because you've always been so fair and very generous and personally very good to me. Is there a way that we could vote on which direction to go on this?
Well, you know, it's actually up to the chairman. But let me say what I'd like to do. You know, I would give a minute to two on this side and a minute to two on this side, and that's it. I mean, we have to move forward. I mean, we have a scheduled hearing that's here looking for certain information. Looking for certain information. In order to get the information, we need to talk to the present secretary. We need to talk to the past, and of course, we have other that we still want to
Mr. Chairman, I join with you in that unanimous consent for 2 additional minutes per side, equally divided.
Right.
Reserving the right to object. Mr. Chairman, I just want to say that any member of this committee has the ability to submit questions in writing.
Sure.
Mr. Geithner, in response to an earlier question, said that, in the interest of time, that he would be willing to answer questions in writing. Is that not true, Mr. Geithner?
Absolutely, of course.
Okay, so Mr. Chairman, anybody who wouldn't get a chance to ask a question here can still put it in writing. I withdraw any objection.
Right. Let me just say that we will go two on this side, 2 on that side,
Mr. Chairman.
but a minute. Remember,
Mr.
yes.
Chairman, reserving the right to object.
Yeah. Yeah. What, I mean, I don't know what you're objecting to.
If you'll recognize me, unanimous consent request for 2 minutes each. I'd be happy to, Mr. Chairman, to forego my time with Secretary Paulson to ask Secretary Geithner.
Well, I wish we could operate that way, but you know, when you have hearings that are structured, they're not structured in the fact that someone would give up their time. You know, I mean, that's not the way we do it. So the point of the matter is that we either accept the 2 minutes on the side or we move forward. Okay, so that's what's on the table. So 2 minutes on this side, 2 minutes on that side. Okay, you want to designate?
I withdraw my objection.
We'll designate the 2 on this side. Mr. Connolly, you have a minute. to raise one question with the Secretary. Mr. Conley from Virginia.
And then our two gentlemen.
Okay.
Are you ready to go? Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you.
Recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Geithner, we only have 1 minute, and one has the sense that some people in this room perhaps want to rewrite history, and I understand, given the history, why they might want to do that. In your opening statement, you talked about the need for financial regulatory reform. Could you expand on why we need that, particularly when it comes to regulating that which was resisted from regulation in the past, like derivatives and credit default swaps?
I don't think it's a hard case to make. I think you just have to look at the wreckage caused by the crisis to say the system failed dramatically. And again, the two most simple failures that happen is people were allowed to take risk without constraints. We let a system operate where institutions that were huge and consequential operated with no adult supervision, with no constraints, and they brought the country to the edge of collapse. Let me just say one thing in common with the following firms: Fannie and Freddie, the largest investment banks in the country, AIG, a set of specialized insurance companies, a whole range of consumer finance companies, a bunch of sorts. They all had one thing in common, which they were not subject to a set of sensible rules to constrain the risk they had to take. What we propose in financial reform is to change that. It's a simple imperative. That's not enough, though, because people will make mistakes in the future. So we need to make sure when they make those mistakes that we can let them fail, and failure can happen without catastrophic damage. We need to be able to contain the damage, isolate it, draw a line around it, put them out of their misery, put them out of existence without the taxpayer being exposed. And we need to make sure that we don't have a system where the taxpayer is exposed to the risk of loss, or that investors and creditors live with the expectation the government will be there again. And again, that's something that is I think we all have a huge obligation, responsibility. It was the laws of the land that allowed that to happen, the laws of the land that made it impossible for the government to act, and I think we need to work together to change that.
I thank the gentleman, and I thank the chairman for his consideration.
Thank you very much. I now recognize Mr. Fortenberry for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, welcome. For the last year and a half, we've been privatizing profits and socializing risk. And if the optics on the AIG aren't bad enough, the counterparties to the AIG who received 100% parity for their liabilities, 7 of the top 10 are foreign firms. Societe Generale was the top recipient of $16.5 billion of American taxpayer bailouts, in effect, followed by Goldman Sachs. Now, you said this economy is in crisis. This year, Goldman Sachs will give $16 billion of bonus payments, about $500,000 per employee. This is really difficult to understand why there wasn't, at first, a desire to have transparency in regards to counterparty transactions. Would you address that, please?
Oh, I'm not sure if you were here for the prior conversation.
I've been here the entire time,
okay,
except for votes.
But again, the actions we took were necessary in the public interest, better than the alternatives, to help prevent catastrophic damage. And if you are outraged, as I think you should be, about how the economy and our system was in this mess, I hope you will join with us in trying to work to make sure it doesn't happen in the future. This is not something that should be Republican or Democrat. There is a deep, I think, moral obligation we have to try to make sure that we put in place reforms that will prevent this from happening again. If the government had done that sooner, this would have been less damaging. And a critical part of the failure was we ran a country, largest economy in the world, largest financial system in the world, without having the kind of bankruptcy-type powers we had for banks for decades.
Let's try to do that on a bipartisan basis, sir, please. But you understand why the failure
I'm sorry, the gentleman's time
has
has expired, and now I recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Congressman Davis, for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary. Let me just ask, if you had to do it again, to do it all over, would you change any of the decisions that you made in the fall of 2008 to rescue AIG and pay the counterparties part?
Congressman, again, as I think about this a lot, and one of the great strengths of our country is, again, people will be able to look back and come to their own judgment whether we made the best choices. But I am very confident that we made the best of a set of terrible choices that there were no better alternatives. We did not have the option of bankruptcy. We did not have the option of default. We did not have the option of selective haircuts. It would have been catastrophic to let the institution fail. We didn't rescue AIG. We intervened so that we could dismember it safely without it wrecking the country and the system. I think the big mistakes we made as a country, and they are mistakes that we have to reflect on deeply for a long time, were why the government didn't act sooner to limit risk-taking, why the government did provide competent authorities the ability to contain risk-taking, and why didn't we have in place the kind of tools we've had for a long time for banks to try to deal with these kind of failures. I think those were tragic mistakes. The lesson of financial crises is if you don't act sooner, things get to the point where they can cause catastrophic damage, and if you stand back and hope it'll burn itself out, correct itself, it'll be a good, healthy adjustment for the economy, that can cause enormous damage. And it'll cause enormous damage not just to the American lives and people we'll be living with for a long time, but to the revenue base of the country, deeply impairs the capacity for government to do things that are necessary, like that we need resources for, protect national security, make sure teachers can be in the schools. These things are deeply connected. If you stand back and try to hope the market will fix itself, you court catastrophe. I hope we learn that lesson. Should never happen again.
Thank you very much. Gentleman, time has expired. And I recognize the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Chaffee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary. I was going to ask about the 18 phone calls you made to Rahm Emanuel, more than any other member of Congress, but we'll have to save that for another day. What I would like to ask you about is this idea that they're going to make profits. I'm going to read two statements and ask you a question from Neil Barofsky's testimony that's coming up. First one is, quote, on page 13, Treasury's own TARP financial statement estimates that Treasury will not be made whole, but is rather projected to lose more than $30 billion on its AIG investments. Second quote later in the same paragraph, narrowly asserting that taxpayers will be, quote, made whole, end quote, on Maiden Lane 3, just one part of the AIG counterparty transactions, without mentioning the huge losses Treasury expects to suffer on other inextricably linked parts of the very same transactions, is simply unacceptable. The American people deserve better. So my question, in hoping that you could respond to those two statements, is, when you refer to profits from the AIG counterparty bailout, are you counting the cost of the $35 billion in cash AIG handed over to counterparties, or just the $27 billion they got directly from the New York Fed?
Congressman, I think that Mr. Borowski and I actually agree on this, and I said in my statement, I was very clear. The government is still exposed to substantial risk of loss on its investments in AIG. The Federal Reserve, in this transaction, I think more generally, is unlikely to face any loss. That is a good thing. We should welcome that. But the government is still exposed to risk of loss. We don't know how large those losses will be. What we refer to is not a projection. It's just an estimate based on current market prices. But the really important thing, and I hope you will join us in this, is if we adopt this financial responsibility fee, the taxpayer will not bear a penny of the burden for
sounds
what we
like
did
a tax to me. It doesn't
under
sound,
the TARP.
Sounds like a tax to me. And that,
well, you can call it what you want, but what it is a simple
I call it
principle.
a tax, and I wish you would too. I'd call it what it is.
Well, you know, again, in the law that Congress passed authorizing these actions, Congress required the Secretary of the Treasury to propose a way to make sure taxpayers are held harmless. We did that. I hope you will join us in supporting that, because there is no reason why the American taxpayer should be exposed to a penny of loss in what we did in AIG. We can make that possible.
The gentleman's time has expired. Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary, for your testimony, of course, and you may be excused. Now we call upon our second panel.